April 1945, Bavaria. The corridor was narrow, cold, and lined with women in tattered Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms. They stood silent, eyes downcast, waiting for whatever came next. The war was over for them. Germany was collapsing. They had been told what Americans did to prisoners. A door opened at the end of the hall. Boots echoed on concrete. An American sergeant appeared, clipboard in hand, flanked by two MPs. The women tensed. He approached the first woman in line, a signals operator, barely 20 years old. She braced herself. He stopped, gestured toward the door. "Ladies first," he said in broken German. She didn't move. Confusion flickered across her face. The other women exchanged glances. This was not in the script they had been given. This was not what the propaganda had promised. One of the MPs smiled slightly, stepping aside to hold the door open. The sergeant repeated, slower this time. "After you, ma'am." The young woman hesitated, then walked forward. Nothing happened. No shove, no insult. Just a door held open, and a nod of courtesy. She would later say she cried that night, not from fear, but from the sudden collapse of everything she thought she knew. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was in its death throes. The Third Reich, which had promised a 1,000-year empire, was collapsing under the weight of Allied advances from both East and West. Soviet forces pushed through Poland and into Germany itself, leaving devastation in their wake. American, British, and Canadian troops crossed the Rhine, liberating towns and cities that had once cheered for Hitler. For 12 years, the Nazi regime had built a society on total ideological control. Every aspect of life, education, media, work, family, was filtered through the lens of National Socialist doctrine. Women, though idealized as mothers and homemakers in Nazi propaganda, had been increasingly mobilized for the war effort as Germany's manpower dwindled. By 1943, hundreds of thousands of German women served in auxiliary roles for the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and SS. They operated radios, managed logistics, staffed anti-aircraft batteries, and worked in military administration. These were not combat roles in the traditional sense, but they were essential to the war machine. And under international law, many of these women could be classified as military personnel, subject to capture as prisoners of war. The Nazi narrative about the Allies, particularly the Americans, was unrelenting. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels had spent years crafting an image of the Western enemies as gangsters, criminals, and barbarians. Newspapers published stories, fabricated or exaggerated, of Allied brutality. Radio broadcasts warned German women that capture meant dishonor, violence, and death. The message was clear: better to die fighting than to fall into enemy hands. This was not abstract fear-mongering. It was policy. As the Allies closed in, German authorities distributed cyanide capsules to military personnel and high-ranking party members. Suicide was presented as the honorable option. Propaganda films depicted heroic last stands and martyrdom. The concept of surrender was framed as betrayal, not just of the Führer, but of the entire German race. Women absorbed these messages as much as men. Those serving in auxiliary roles knew they were targets. They had seen what happened when Soviet forces overran German positions in the East. The stories of atrocities, real and rumored, spread quickly. The Western Allies were portrayed as only marginally better. American soldiers, the propaganda claimed, were undisciplined thugs who would show no mercy to German women. But as the front lines collapsed and retreat became impossible, many women found themselves with no choice but to surrender. The American military approached the treatment of prisoners with a framework rooted in both law and pragmatism. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established clear standards for the humane treatment of prisoners of war. While the agreement primarily addressed male combatants, American policy extended protections to all captured personnel, including women in auxiliary military roles. This was not simply humanitarian idealism, it was strategic doctrine. The U.S. Army understood that proper treatment of prisoners served multiple purposes. It encouraged enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. It maintained moral authority in the eyes of neutral nations. And it set a standard that might protect American POWs held by the enemy. Field manuals issued to American forces were explicit. Prisoners were to be disarmed, searched, and processed with respect. Physical abuse was prohibited. Medical care was mandatory. Female prisoners were to be guarded by female personnel when possible, housed separately from men, and treated with particular regard for cultural sensibilities around modesty and dignity. The contrast with the Eastern Front was stark. Soviet forces, who had suffered unimaginable losses and witnessed Nazi atrocities firsthand, showed little mercy to captured Germans. Reports of summary executions, forced labor, and mass violence against German women were widespread. Millions of German civilians and soldiers fled westward, desperate to reach American or British lines rather than Soviet territory. For German women facing capture, the difference between East and West was the difference between survival and annihilation. American soldiers, many of them fresh-faced recruits from small towns and cities across the United States, brought their own cultural values to occupied Germany. The concept of ladies first, holding doors, offering seats, showing deference to women, was ingrained in American upbringing. It was basic manners, unremarkable in peacetime America. But in the militarized, hierarchical culture of Nazi Germany, where courtesy was reserved for those deemed racially pure and ideologically loyal, such gestures were alien. German military culture was rigid, formal, built on dominance and obedience. Women in auxiliary roles were functionaries, not ladies. They received orders, not courtesies. When American soldiers treated German female POWs with the same casual politeness they would show women back home, it created a cognitive dissonance that shattered years of propaganda. These were not the monsters Goebbels had described. They were young men who said please and thank you, who opened doors and offered cigarettes, who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the idea of treating women harshly. For the women who experienced this firsthand, the gap between expectation and reality was profound. They had prepared for brutality. What they received instead was something far more destabilizing: basic human decency. The image of the American soldier in Nazi propaganda was carefully constructed to inspire fear and hatred. Newsreels depicted them as racially inferior, culturally degenerate, and morally bankrupt. Goebbels's machine portrayed the United States as a mongrel nation, corrupted by Jewish influence and capitalism, its military made up of criminals released from prisons to fight. German women were shown images of American soldiers as violent thugs who would loot, assault, and destroy without conscience. The propaganda emphasized that Americans viewed German women as spoils of war, to be taken and discarded. One infamous poster showed a grotesque caricature of an American soldier with the caption, "This is what awaits you." For women in Wehrmacht auxiliary roles, this messaging was reinforced through military briefings and whispered warnings from officers. Surrender, they were told repeatedly, meant a fate worse than death. Some officers distributed weapons to female personnel, with the implicit understanding that the final bullet should be saved for themselves. This indoctrination ran deep. It was not simply about fear, it was about identity. To be captured was to become something less than German, to lose the very essence of what the Nazi ideology had taught them to value. Honor, purity, strength, all would be destroyed in enemy hands. So when the moment of capture came, many women expected violence immediately. The reality of American capture often began with silence. Unlike the chaotic brutality expected, the process was methodical, almost bureaucratic. Women were lined up, counted, searched by female personnel when available, and assigned identification numbers. Medical officers checked for injuries or illness. Food rations were distributed. What struck many prisoners first was the absence of aggression. American soldiers were casual, sometimes bored, occasionally annoyed by the logistical headache of processing thousands of prisoners, but rarely hostile. Some chewed gum. Others smoked cigarettes, offering them to prisoners. A few attempted broken German phrases, mispronouncing words in ways that would have been comical in any other context. One woman, Margarete K., a Luftwaffe telephone operator captured near Munich, later recalled her confusion. I kept waiting for them to hurt us. We stood there for hours, and they just processed paperwork. One soldier complained about the coffee being cold. It was so ordinary. I didn't understand. The disconnect was jarring. These men did not act like conquerors. They acted like clerks, tired and eager to finish their shift. When a young private helped an older woman carry her bag to the processing tent, several prisoners stared in disbelief. Enemies did not carry your bags. In American culture, ladies first was a reflex, taught from childhood. Boys learned to hold doors for their mothers and sisters. Men offered seats to women on buses. It was not about viewing women as weak. It was about showing respect through small acts of courtesy. For many American soldiers, treating female POWs politely was simply how they had been raised. But in Nazi Germany, gender dynamics operated differently. Women were valued for their role as mothers, workers, supporters of the state, but not necessarily afforded personal courtesy outside those functions. Military culture was especially rigid. Hierarchy trumped gender. Orders were given and followed. Politeness was unnecessary. When American guards held doors open, stepped aside to let women pass first, or addressed them as ma'am, it created a moment of cognitive dissonance. One prisoner described it as like waking from a dream where everything was reversed. The phrase ladies first itself, Damen zuerst in German, was familiar, linguistically but alien in practice within the military context they had known. It implied that even as prisoners, they retained some measure of dignity and personhood, that their gender mattered not as a vulnerability to exploit, but as a reason for basic respect. This was not universal, of course. Some American soldiers were indifferent or rude. Wartime stress, exhaustion, and personal prejudice did not disappear simply because of policy. But the overall framework was clear, enough that even small acts of courtesy stood out, starkly against the backdrop of what prisoners had been conditioned to. Expect German women who ended up as POWs came from diverse backgrounds, but most had served in one of several auxiliary organizations. The Nachrichtenhelferinnen operated communications equipment. The Luftwaffenhelferinnen supported anti-aircraft operations. Others worked in administrative roles, managing supplies, personnel records, and logistics for combat units. These were not frontline combatants, but they were integral to military operations. Many wore uniforms, took military oaths, and lived on or near military installations. Under Nazi ideology, their service was framed as patriotic duty, supporting their men, defending the homeland, contributing to the final victory that propaganda still promised even as the Reich crumbled. Most were young, ranging from late teens to early 30s. Some had volunteered, driven by genuine belief in the cause or simply seeking employment and purpose. Others had been conscripted as manpower shortages became critical. By 1944, refusing such service could result in severe consequences for both the woman and her family. When captured, these women occupied an ambiguous space. They were military personnel by function, but had never fired a weapon. They had taken orders, but never given combat commands. American forces classified them as POWs, which afforded them protections under international law, but their treatment varied depending on the commanding officers and the circumstances of capture. What unified most of their experiences was surprise. Surprise at being processed rather than punished. Surprised at being fed rather than starved. Surprised at being addressed with basic courtesy rather than contempt. Communication was often the first bridge or obstacle between captor and captive. Most American soldiers spoke no German beyond a handful of phrases learned from pocket guides. Most German women spoke little to no English. This created situations where intent had to be conveyed through gestures, tone, and context. The U.S. Army employed German-speaking personnel. Some were American-born soldiers who had learned the language academically. Others were German refugees or Jewish émigrés who had fled Nazi persecution years earlier. These interpreters became crucial intermediaries, translating not just words but cultural context. Some interpreters were blunt, matter-of-fact, treating prisoners with professional distance. Others showed empathy, particularly those who had family ties to Germany or understood the propaganda that had shaped these women's fears. One interpreter, a Jewish refugee named Hans B., later wrote in his memoirs, "I had every reason to hate them. But when I saw how terrified they were, how young some of them looked, I couldn't. They were victims, too, in their own way." Language also revealed cultural differences in unexpected ways. The formal German distinction between sei, formal you, and du, informal you, had no equivalent in English. American soldiers, used to casualness, would address prisoners with the same tone they used with anyone. To German ears, accustomed to rigid formality in military settings, this informality was disorienting, but also humanizing. When an American sergeant asked a prisoner, "You okay, miss?" through an interpreter, the question itself was jarring. Enemies did not ask if you were okay. The difference between American and Soviet treatment of German prisoners was not subtle. It was the difference between order and chaos, between policy and vengeance. Soviet forces had endured the full horror of Nazi occupation. Cities razed, populations massacred, prisoners starved and worked to death. The Wehrmacht's invasion of the Soviet Union had been a war of annihilation, and the Red Army remembered. When they captured German women, military or civilian, mercy was rare. Reports from the Eastern Front told of mass violence, summary executions, and forced labor camps in Siberia where survival rates were abysmal. German women fleeing westward carried stories of atrocities that matched or exceeded the propaganda they had been fed about the Soviets, except these stories were true. American forces were aware of this contrast. Some used it deliberately during interrogations, reminding prisoners how fortunate they were to have surrendered to the Western Allies rather than the Soviets. It was a psychological tool, but it was also factual. The Geneva Conventions were largely observed in American custody. In Soviet custody, they were ignored. For German female POWs, this knowledge added another layer to their confusion. They had been taught that all enemies were equally barbaric. Yet, here they were, treated with a level of decency that stood in stark contrast to what they knew was happening to prisoners in the East. The propaganda had lied, not about Soviet brutality, which was real, but about American intentions. This realization forced many to question everything else they had been told. The psychological shift did not happen instantly. It unfolded in stages, through accumulated moments that chipped away at years of indoctrination until the entire structure collapsed. For many women, the first crack appeared during medical examinations. American medics treated injuries without judgment or cruelty. One prisoner, Erica S., had sustained shrapnel wounds to her leg during an air raid days before capture. She expected the wounds to be ignored, perhaps to become infected, leading to amputation or death. Instead, a young Army medic cleaned and dressed the injury, administered sulfa drugs to prevent infection, and checked on her daily until it began healing. "He called me Miss," she later recalled. "Not prisoner, not enemy, Miss. As if I were a person he might meet on a street corner back home." Another woman, Helga M., a signals operator from Berlin, described the moment she realized the Americans were not going to harm them. "We were given blankets. Real blankets, not rags. And soup. It was thin, but it was warm. One of the guards saw me shivering and brought me coffee. Coffee. I started crying and couldn't stop." These small acts accumulated. Women who had braced themselves for brutality found themselves treated with a mundane professionalism that was almost worse than violence would have been, because it meant everything they had believed was wrong. The ladies' first moment became a recurring experience across POW camps. Throughout southern Germany and Austria in April and May 1945, it happened in mess halls, where guards gestured for women to enter before men. It happened at medical stations, where female prisoners were seen first, regardless of rank. It happened in administrative lines, where American personnel stepped aside with a casual politeness that bordered on the absurd given the circumstances. One particularly striking account came from a holding facility near Regensburg. A group of 30 female auxiliaries had been captured after their communications post was overrun. They were marched to a makeshift camp, exhausted and terrified. When they arrived, an American lieutenant organized them into a line for processing. As he prepared to lead them into the registration building, he paused, stepped back, and held the door open. "After you, ladies," he said through an interpreter. No one moved. The women stared at him, then at each other. One began to laugh, a strange, brittle sound that bordered on hysteria. Another whispered, "Is this a trick?" The lieutenant looked confused. The interpreter explained the women's hesitation. The lieutenant shrugged and repeated more firmly this time, "Go ahead. We're not going to hurt you." The first woman stepped forward, then another, then all of them filed through the door. Inside, they found tables with registration forms, chairs to sit in, and clerks who took their names and service records with the same bored efficiency they might use processing supply requisitions. It was profoundly, disturbingly ordinary. But perhaps the most transformative moment came when women began comparing their treatment to stories they had heard or experienced under their own military hierarchy. Whispered conversations in barracks at night revealed uncomfortable truths. Some women admitted they had been treated more harshly by their own officers than by American captors. Orders had been screamed. Mistakes had been punished brutally. Respect had been conditional, earned only through perfect obedience and ideological loyalty. Here, in captivity, they were addressed with baseline courtesy that had been absent in their own ranks. The breaking point came not through grand gestures, but through sustained consistency. Day after day, the expected violence never materialized. Instead, routine settled in, meals at regular times, medical checks, even organized recreation periods where prisoners could walk outside under minimal guard. One woman, Ilsa W., a former radio operator from Hamburg, kept a hidden diary throughout her captivity. Her entries from late April 1945 chart the psychological transformation in real time. April 22nd. They have not hurt us. I do not understand. Are they waiting? For what? April 27th. A guard shared his chocolate ration with the children in the next compound. Why would he do this? May 3rd. I asked for paper to write to my mother. They gave it to me. No questions, no punishment, just paper and a pencil. May 8th. The war is over. We heard the announcement. Some women cried. I felt nothing. Only confusion. We were told we would die as martyrs. Instead, we are alive, and they are still being kind. The collapse of Nazi Germany forced a reckoning that went beyond military defeat. For these women, the personal collapse was equally profound. Everything they had been taught about enemies, about sacrifice, about honor, it had all been constructed on lies. The moment of full realization often came through contrast. When Soviet-held prisoners began being transferred west as occupation zones were established, American camps received new arrivals, women who had experienced capture by the Red Army. Their condition was shocking. Malnourished, traumatized, some barely able to speak. The stories they told confirmed the worst fears about Soviet treatment. Women who had surrendered to Americans began to understand how fortunate they were. One prisoner, confronted with a survivor from Soviet captivity, broke down, "I was ready to kill myself rather than surrender. If I had encountered Russians instead of Americans, I would be dead, or worse." This knowledge created a strange, uncomfortable gratitude that many struggled to process. How could you be grateful to your enemy? How could you reconcile the humanity shown by your captors with years of propaganda depicting them as monsters? The cognitive dissonance reached its peak during repatriation preparations. As Germany was divided into occupation zones, prisoners were sorted by their home regions. Women from areas that would become Soviet-controlled East Germany faced a grim reality. They would be released into a new authoritarian regime. Some begged to remain in American custody. Others asked if they could go west instead. American authorities had limited options. Repatriation was mandatory under international agreements, but some officers bent rules where possible, processing paperwork slowly or losing records to buy time for prisoners to make connections with relatives in Western zones. One American captain, interviewed years later, described the moral complexity. We knew what they were going back to. Some of them had been true believers in Nazism. I'm not naive about that. But others were just kids who got swept up. Sending them east felt like handing them to a different kind of tyranny. We did what we could. The final ladies' first moments came at camp gates during release. Women lined up with their processed paperwork, ready to return to whatever remained of their lives. American guards, some of whom had spent weeks or months overseeing these prisoners, stood at the exits, and once again, doors were held open. Hats were tipped. "Good luck, ma'am," was said in broken German or through interpreters. Some women thanked them. Others left in silence, still processing emotions they had no framework to understand. A few stopped at the gate, turned back, and simply nodded, an acknowledgement that something had shifted, that the script they had been given no longer applied. One woman later testified, "I walked out of that camp more confused than when I walked in. They had defeated us, humiliated our nation, destroyed everything we knew. But they had treated me like a human being. I didn't know which was worse, the defeat, or realizing the enemy had been more decent than we were taught to be." The mass release of German POWs began in summer 1945 and continued through 1946. Women were among the first to be repatriated, prioritized due to international pressure and practical considerations. Housing, guarding, and managing female prisoners required resources the occupying forces preferred to redirect elsewhere. But returning home meant returning to a country that no longer existed in any recognizable form. Cities were rubble. Infrastructure was destroyed. Millions were dead or missing. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, each governed by different Allied powers with different policies and priorities. For women who had been prisoners of the Americans, reintegration was complicated by what they had experienced. In a society grappling with collective trauma and defeat, their stories were uncomfortable. Admitting that American captors had been decent contradicted the narratives many Germans still clung to, that they had been fighting a righteous defensive war, that all sides were equally brutal, that defeat was merely a matter of overwhelming enemy resources. Some women stayed silent, never speaking of their captivity. Others shared their experiences only within trusted circles. Family members, close friends, fellow survivors. A few faced outright hostility, accused of collaboration or weakness for not resisting unto death, as propaganda had demanded. One woman, returning to her destroyed hometown near Frankfurt, was confronted by a neighbor who had lost 2 sons in the war. "You survived while they died? What did you do to earn that?" The question was cruel, but it reflected a broader discomfort. Survival itself had become suspect, yet amid the rubble and trauma, seeds of change were planted. Women who had experienced American treatment carried with them a lived contradiction to Nazi ideology. They had seen that enemies could be humane, that hierarchy did not require cruelty, that basic decency could exist even in war. These were not lessons easily discussed in the immediate post-war chaos, but they lingered. Some women became advocates for reconciliation as Germany rebuilt. Others simply lived differently, raising children with different values, questioning authority in ways they never would have before. As Germany began its long process of reconstruction and reckoning, the experiences of female POWs became part of a larger, often painful conversation about the war and its legacy. By the 1960s and 1970s, as a new generation came of age asking difficult questions about their parents' complicity in Nazi crimes, some women began speaking more openly about their captivity. Oral history projects, conducted by universities and research institutes, captured these testimonies. What emerged was a complex picture, not of universal kindness, but of a treatment framework that stood in stark contrast to both Nazi propaganda and Soviet reality. Margaret K., the telephone operator captured near Munich, gave an interview in 1978. "For years, I didn't talk about it. People didn't want to hear that the Americans had been decent. It complicated the narrative of victimhood we told ourselves. But it was true. They treated us better than our own officers often had." The long-term psychological impact varied. Some women suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress, not from abuse in captivity, but from the cognitive dissonance of having their worldview shattered. Others expressed a quiet gratitude that took decades to articulate. A few maintained that the decent treatment had been strategic manipulation, unable or unwilling to abandon the framework they had been raised in. Children of these women, growing up in post-war Germany, heard fragments of stories that shaped their understanding of war and humanity. One daughter, now a historian, reflected, "My mother told me about an American guard who gave her his jacket when she was cold. It was such a small thing, but it stayed with her for 50 years. It taught me that even in the worst circumstances, individuals can choose kindness." The ladies' first moment, that seemingly trivial gesture of holding a door, became symbolic in retrospect. It represented the gap between propaganda and reality, between expected brutality and experienced humanity. In memoirs and interviews, it appeared again and again, not as the most important moment of captivity, but as the most memorable, because it was the moment when certainty cracked. Post-war German-American relations benefited from these individual experiences in ways difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. As West Germany became a crucial Cold War ally, the foundation of trust was built partly on personal memories of decent treatment. Veterans from both sides participated in reconciliation efforts. Former prisoners corresponded with former guards. Museums and memorial sites documented these stories alongside the broader history of the war. In 2005, on the 60th anniversary of Germany's surrender, a group of elderly women who had been POWs returned to the site of a former American camp near Munich. The barracks were long gone, replaced by a housing development, but they placed a small plaque, "In memory of unexpected mercy." One of them, Erica S., now in her 80s, spoke to a small gathering. "We were enemies. We had done terrible things or supported those who did. We deserved punishment. Instead, we received basic human decency. That gift, because that's what it was, changed how we understood the world. I hope we passed that understanding to our children." The legacy endures in quiet ways. In classrooms where teachers use these stories to illustrate the difference between propaganda and truth. In families where grandmothers' memories challenge simplistic narratives of good and evil. In the recognition that war's cruelty is not inevitable, that even in combat's aftermath, choices remain. War reduces nations to slogans, people to enemies, and humanity to abstractions. It thrives on the belief that the other side is fundamentally different, monstrous, barbaric, unworthy of the consideration we reserve for our own. The German women who walked through doors held open by American guards experienced the collapse of that belief in real time. They had been prepared for demons and found men, tired, young, often uncomfortable men who had been raised to say please and thank you, who held doors because their mothers had taught them to, who treated prisoners with the same reflexive courtesy they would offer strangers on a bus. This was not mercy in the grand sense. No dramatic gestures of forgiveness or redemption. It was something simpler and perhaps more powerful: the refusal to dehumanize. The phrase "ladies first" seems almost absurdly small against the backdrop of history. Millions dead, cities destroyed, a continent in ruins. Yet for the women who heard it, it represented a fracture in everything they thought they knew. It was proof that propaganda lies, that enemies are not monsters, and that decency can survive even in the machinery of war. These moments did not erase guilt or justify the horrors of the Nazi regime. They did not absolve anyone of complicity or wash away the stains of history, but they demonstrated that individuals, even within the structure of military occupation, retain the capacity to choose how they treat others, and sometimes that choice, to hold a door, to offer courtesy, to see a prisoner as a person, can echo across generations, reminding us that humanity persists even when systems try to crush it.